The war in Ethiopia, now a year old, has caused many millions to be displaced, fleeing from fighting between combined rebel forces and the embattled government. And it's left almost 500,000 facing famine. Despite the efforts of the US Special Envoy, Jeffrey Feltman, to push for peaceful negotiation, the conflict between the government and the estimated 9 rebel forces, including the Tigray People's Liberation Front, who the supposedly federal government of the Prime Minister, Mr Abiy, sidelined last year, is now threatening to encroach on the capital, Addis Ababa. The government has taken on emergency powers and is imploring former soldiers to take up arms against the rebels and bury the enemy with our blood and bones. Here's our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban.
There's alarm in the international community because rebel forces are closing in on the Ethiopian capital. The US has urged its citizens to leave, and the UN is trying to get a ceasefire. But in Addis Ababa itself, there's little sign of imminent collapse.
Ethiopians should be committed to go to the extreme to stop these traitors and their allied forces.
For the past year, the Ethiopian military's been fighting rebels in the Tigray region in the north. It's been a bitter struggle, with both sides alleging atrocities. But the Tigrayan rebels have got the better of it, moving outside their traditional lands, closer to the capital, and to close off Ethiopia's access to the sea via Eritrea. They've also been joined by other rebel groups, representing peoples like the Oromo. In recent days, thousands of Ethiopian troops have surrendered, and the threat to the capital has become real. Attention will focus on the future of Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister. He launched the Tigray War and has become unacceptable to several of the ethnic groups. He's also used blockade as a weapon against the rebel province, leading to allegations that he's tried to starve them by stopping aid. That conflict and the likelihood that Ethiopia's fractured patchwork of ethnic and political groups will find it hard to agree a successor creates a risk of prolonged civil war and a national unravelling. It's believed 2.5 million people have already been displaced by the conflict, and as it spreads, that could just worsen.
Mark Urban. Well, joining me now is Amnesty International's Horn of Africa campaigner Vanessa Sehe and journalist and academic Martin Plaut, whose research specialises in the Horn of Africa and Southern Africa and is a former BBC World Service Africa editor. Good evening to you both. First, Vanessa Sehe, could you give us a sense of the humanitarian task?
I mean, the humanitarian situation has been terrible since the conflict started last year. And right now, there's been restrictions put upon Tigray. Only, almost 90% of all humanitarian aid is being blocked from entering the region. Millions of people are at risk of starvation. The health situation has deteriorated because of the lack of medicine. There's no fuel coming in, which is leading to humanitarian operations having to be suspended or to scale down dramatically. So the situation is terrible.
Well, Martin Plaut, you've been reporting from the Horn of Africa since the 1980s. How critical a moment is this, do you think?
Oh, it's very critical indeed. I mean, this is the largest war currently going on in the world. Best estimates are that between 100,000 and 200,000 people have died. I mean, Prime Minister Abiy has thrown young men into this battle, armed with no more than machetes and hoes, and they're up against the Tigrayans, who were an elected government in the region, who are armed with machine guns. So you can imagine the slaughter is appalling. Now,
it's extraordinary to think that Mr Abiy in 2019, the Prime Minister, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize just 2 years ago for the work with the Eritreans. And now he's calling ex-soldiers and militias to arms. I mean, is there a point at which it is simply too dangerous for any aid worker to be working here, Isabella Hussein? Say hey.
I mean, there has been, UN groups and NGOs have been sending back personnel. We've seen the expulsion of humanitarian workers. And in the past week, since I think 28th of October, no humanitarian workers have been allowed in or out from the region. So there's been several restrictions put upon NGO workers in the region, regardless if they're doing it by choice or not.
So are you saying that if NGOs can't work, then the starvation will be much more widespread than the horrific number of 500,000 already facing famine?
Absolutely. I mean, the response on the ground is already inadequate. And with the more and more restrictions, both on the aid and for the aid workers, situation will get worse. And these are, situations that they are not in control of themselves. And then there will come a point, of course, when it's too dangerous. And that's been a problem as well, where aid workers have been restricted by their own organizations. This is too dangerous.
So Martin Plout, who can come to Ethiopia's aid? We know that the US Special Envoy has tried to broker negotiations. That obviously is not working. So what is the next step?
Well, I think, frankly, there isn't a next step which is diplomatic. The African Union has tried to intervene. They were turned down by Prime Minister Abiy right in the beginning of this conflict a year ago. The East African leaders have called for negotiations, but they're only going to take place in about a couple of weeks' time. So really, it's likely that the fighting will reach the gates of Addis Ababa itself. And the reason that Tigrayans are fighting with such ferocity is that they're sealed from the north by the Eritreans and from the south by the Ethiopian army and various militia. And their people are dying. They have no alternative but to fight their way out. If there was another way, which there is, it would be for the British and the Americans to launch an airlift, as they did in 1984-85. You may remember Mrs. Thatcher launched an airlift into the region. But of course, that was done with the permission of the Ethiopian government. Currently, that's highly unlikely to be allowed to happen. But it could be allowed if the United Nations says this is so severe that the sovereignty of Ethiopia has to be violated to save lives. But I can't see that really happening. There was a Security Council meeting today in New York where they called for a ceasefire. But a ceasefire with what? The Tigrayans still blockaded? I can't see that working.
And there is no leverage on Mr. Abiy at all in terms of financial aid or anything then?
Well, the Americans have, there's a new bill before Congress which will cut off aid to Ethiopia, which would put some pressure on them. And after all, if the Tigrayans cut the road to the port of Djibouti, then Ethiopia will be without fuel. So that would be another way in which he might be forced to the negotiating table. But it's going to be extremely difficult. And, the Tigrayans and their allies are facing two armies, the armies of two nations, both Eritrea and Ethiopia. This is a very hard fight. And the fact they've survived is quite a miracle.
And there is, of course, Vanessa, the chance that, of course, the refugees are going to spill over the borders into other countries in the Horn of Africa. It could be Kenya, Somalia, Sudan. How possible is it that there's going to be a complete destabilization of the region?
Of course, there's been spillover in terms of people, but also of different issues that are happening in Somalia and Kenya that have, resulted from the war. And an unstable Ethiopia makes it an unstable region. So anything is possible these days. But hopefully, if we can contain the conflict in the country, that will contain the situation.
Thank you both very much indeed for joining us.